Hello, everyone. This is the 51st episode of the Soccernostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles, and I'm joined by Paul from Shipley in England. We are pleased to have Mr. John O'Carroll once again on our podcast. Mr. O'Carroll is an Irish freelance writer, historian, and broadcaster. For this episode, we continue our interview series with Mr. John O'Carroll as we discuss the matches of the Republic of Ireland national team during the 1985-86 season. Welcome back, John.
Thank you very much, Shahan. Always lovely to be on your podcast. And thank you for the invite once again.
Thank you. Last time we left off in the summer of 1985. Republic of Ireland's World Cup qualification was in doubt. However, they had ended the season on a positive note with a 3-0 win over Switzerland. At this point, Denmark seemed likely to qualify, and Ireland had 3 matches, 2 of them away, to make a last push for the second spot ahead of the Soviet Union. This would be a season that would change the destiny of this Ireland generation and pave the way for the arrival of Jackie Charlton and the beginning of Ireland's most glorious decade. So let's start the season on September 11, 1985, as Switzerland hosted Republic of Ireland at Bern's Wankdorf Stadion. For this match, Ireland manager Owen Hand had one new cap, Tony Cascarino of Gillingham. But let me go through the Ireland lineup first. You have Seamus McDonough in goal from Notts County, Chris Hughton of Tottenham, David O'Leary of Arsenal, Mick McCarthy of Manchester City, James Beglin of Liverpool, Jerry Daly of Birmingham City. He replaced by Paul McGrath of Manchester United in the 66th minute. Liam Brady from Internazionale Milano in Italy. Mark Lawrenson of Liverpool. He had been pushed into midfield as McCarthy and O'Leary formed a central defensive partnership. And Lawrenson would suffer in this uncomfortable position, new position for him. Then you have Kevin Sheedy of Everton. He'd replaced by Kevin O'Callaghan of Portsmouth in the 70th minute. Captaining the side, Frank Stapleton of Manchester United. And the new cap, Tony Cascarino of Gillingham. And it was said that Cascarino was recommended to Hand by an English sports writer. And we should mention that Ireland were missing Ronnie Whelan and David Langan. And I'll quickly go through the Switzerland lineup as well before we discuss the match. You have Karl Engel of Neuchâtel Xamax, Alan Geiger of Servette, Charles in Albon of Grasshopper, Heinz Hermann of Neuchâtel Xamax, Andre Egli of Grasshopper, Marco Schalibam of Grasshopper. He was replaced by Jean-Paul Briguet of Sion in the 75th minute. Philippe Perret of Neuchâtel Xamax. Georges Bregui of Young Boys Bern. Marcel Kohler of Grasshopper. Robert Luthi of Neuchâtel. And Christian Mate of Grasshopper. For the side manager by Paul Wolfisberg. So the match would end in a scoreless tie. What are your thoughts on the match?
Yes, indeed, Shahan. Well, first of all, you gave an excellent summation of the match there. Apparently, by all accounts, the full match is available on YouTube. I managed to look at it myself on the course last year, and it seemed to be a tepid enough affair. Little chances, or not many chances created by either team. Now, Switzerland were still in with a chance of qualification going into this match, but for some reason, they played 5 in midfield, and it seems the thinking behind that was to stifle the Irish midfield. But the result of that was when Switzerland played 5 in midfield, there was little creativity, and chances from both sides tended to be few and far between. Now, just a couple of points about the Irish team. Frank Stapleton was captain in the team, and as far as I'm aware, this could have been the first time he captained the team under Owen Hand, because throughout Owen Hand's time as manager, first of all, it was Tony Grealish was captain, and then Liam Brady took the armband. But for this game, even though Liam Brady was playing, Frank Stapleton took the captain's armband. And of course, Frank Stapleton then was Jack Charlton's regular captain in Jack Charlton's early years as Republic of Ireland manager. Tony Cascarino that you mentioned, this was his competitive debut. He was with Gillingham at the time. Now, Tony Cascarino had made his debut for Ireland the previous month in a non-cap testimonial match in Dalymount Park in Dublin. And the testimonial match was for Jimmy Holmes, who played as a defender for Tottenham in the late 70s and was also a Republic of Ireland international, but unfortunately suffered a career-ending injury in a game against Bulgaria in 1979. So the FAI organised a testimonial match for Jimmy Holmes in August of 1985. Even though no caps was awarded, a full, or to all intents and purposes, a full Irish international team took part against a Tottenham Hotspur 11. And Tony Cascarino actually made his debut for the Irish team in this testimonial game. But as you say, Shahan, this game against Switzerland in September would have been Tony's competitive debut. You mentioned there about Mark Lawson, that he moved to midfield and he was uncomfortable there, which was a little bit surprising, because when in the early 1980s, or in the late 70s, when Mark Lawson made his debut for Ireland, he played some of his early matches in midfield. I'm thinking in particular now of a game against the Dutch back at the start of the 1982 World Cup qualifying campaign, where Mark Lawson did play in midfield, and he actually scored what turned out to be the winning goal. So he was one of these players that could play anywhere, but for some reason things didn't go too well for him in this particular game. Maybe it was down to the fact that Switzerland were playing five in midfield, so maybe the midfield area was congested, and maybe it didn't leave room, for the creative players to have space in the ball and maybe make an impact on the game. Again, because the midfield was congested, there was little service to Stapleton and Cascarino. I mentioned there was little quality play in the game. I believe there was 52 free kicks in total awarded. Now, at one stage in the game, Frank Stapleton had a chance to score, but he missed the opportunity when he failed to connect from a cross. And
he also scored a goal in the last minute that was ruled out as offside.
That's right, yes, that's right. Yes, and for some reason, there was little protests from the Irish side. So maybe at that stage, whether some of the Irish players maybe had given up the ghost and them getting a positive result out of this game or not, I don't know. But strangely enough, the protests were muted. But this 0-0 draw anyway, it effectively killed off both teams' chances of qualifying, because both teams at this stage were chasing Denmark and the Soviet Union, and both teams needed a win in order to keep alive their chances. But it wasn't to be anyway, and the 0-0 draw effectively ruled both teams out of qualification, and it just left the way open for the USSR and Denmark to take the two qualification spots in the group. Now, just to quickly mention Switzerland, Shahan, Marcel Koller in the noughties, he actually managed in the Bundesliga. He managed FC Köln and he managed Bochum. And then, of course, back in 2011 and up to 2017, he managed Austria. He has had quite a good managerial career.
As far as the match also, we mentioned that Switzerland had five in midfield. According to some reports, Owen Hand withdrew Brady further back as a result of the five Swiss midfielders. And apparently Swiss attacked more in the first half and Ireland more in the second half. But overall, it turned out to be a dull match by all accounts.
Yes. That's right, yes, that's right. And as I say, the full game is available on YouTube because it was broadcast live in Ireland. So, yeah, but as you say, Shahan, in an overall sense, it was a dull type of affair, and it did nothing for both teams' chances of progressing from the group.
Ireland's next qualifier was on October 16th. It was to be at Moscow's Lenin Stadium against the Soviet Union. Now, there are some stories going into this match. Owen Hand had traveled late in September to watch the Soviet Union match against Denmark that the Soviets won 1-0. While there, he was able to observe some of the bureaucratic obstacles to overcome. Apparently, there were reports of food shortages and such. So he demanded from the Irish Federation to take the food along, as well as a chef. However, the Federation agreed on the food, but because they felt having a chef would be too costly, they refused. So Owen Hand's wife, Pat Hand, volunteered free of charge to be the cook for the trip. And Owen Hand had already negotiated with an Irish hotel for the food to take along. There's a story that Owen Hand went to the headquarters at Merrion Square to discuss arrangements with Treasurer Charlie Walsh and the Secretary O'Driscoll. However, the pair were apparently more interested in arguing as to who would travel with the team. Both officials eventually stormed out in anger, and Hand had to lock up and turn off the lights at the headquarters. Another story is that in London, just before their flight to Moscow, Owen Hand had wanted to show videos of the Soviet Union matches, but the hotel that they were staying at levied a charge of £30 for the use of a video machine. So again, this is another story that shows how the Federation was shorting cash. That Federation treasurer said that he had a relative in London who had a VCR, and they could cut the cost by borrowing it from his relative. So
yes. Yeah, of course, the FAI living up to their reputation at the time, once again, of a penny pinching.
Yes, and this is all before the match. So
yes, but but actually, Shahan, you mentioned there the USSR Denmark game, and in the research for this podcast, I perused through Owen Hand's autobiography, and Owen Hand gives quite, shall we say, a colourful account of his travails travelling to and from Moscow to see that game. Just to, in addition to what you said there, Owen Hand arranged to travel to Moscow to see the USSR Denmark game on 25th of September. And he also wanted to assess Moscow's Sport Hotel. Now, the Sport Hotel was the hotel where Ireland were due to be staying the following month for their qualifying match. And Hand encountered many problems. First of all, well, you outlined, of course, the difficulty, the lead up to the USSR Ireland game, that he had to bring along his wife in order to cook the food. But going back to the USSR Denmark game, as I said, Owen, first of all, he had to persuade the FAI that he should attend the game. His travel visa to Moscow was only secured after numerous attempts. He travelled via Zurich, where he met Paul Fulfesberg, who was the Swiss manager at the time. And Paul Fulfesberg was also on his way to Moscow to watch this game. So when Owen Hand arrived in Moscow anyway, nobody was on hand to meet him. And about half an hour later, a Russian official arrived. He handed Owen Hand a match ticket and ordered him to go to the National Hotel to get his accreditation. And of course, Owen Hand objected to this because Owen Hand wanted to check out the Sport Hotel, where, as I said, Ireland would have been staying the following month. But Owen Hand's objections anyway fell on deaf ears. So Owen had no option but to make his way to the National Hotel. But in the process of doing so, Owen made his way to the nearest taxi rank. He managed to flag down a taxi, which, as he describes, was a broken up ladder. And when he sat into the taxi, he felt something unusual. And before he could move, a spring came right through the seat and ripped the backside out of his trousers. And if that wasn't bad enough, Owen had no spare trousers with him. So when Owen arrived at the National Hotel, no accreditation was waiting for him. And to finish up anyway, he had to obtain assistance from the Irish Embassy in Moscow to obtain his accreditation. Now, Owen Hand was on good terms at this time with Sepp Piontek, who was the Danish team manager. And thanks to the Irish Embassy, Owen was able to telephone the Sport Hotel where he got talking directly to Sepp Piątek. And Owen Hand anyway explained the problems he was having to Sepp Piątek. And he was informed that the Danish delegation and the Danish team were having, similar, they were meeting similar logistical problems and organizational problems during their time in Moscow. So Sepp Piątek anyway agreed that Owen Hand could travel on the Danish team bus to the stadium, to the game. And of course, in that, there's shades of 1982 when at the World Cup in Spain, Owen Hand had no accreditation. So to see the Northern Ireland Spain game, he had to ask or procure the assistance of Billy Bingham to travel on the Northern Ireland team bus. So Sepp Piątek anyway agreed for Owen to travel on the Danish team bus, and he also gave Owen a pair of Danish tracksuit bottoms to wear. So that solved the issue of Owen Hand's attire, as it were. So that anyway was the lead up to the game. So the USSR won this game 1-0 anyway. So, but it did give Owen Hand invaluable knowledge into the problems that Ireland could expect 3 weeks later when they went to Moscow to play the game against the USSR. And of course, it also gave Owen a chance to look at Denmark.
Let's talk about this match on October 16th at Moscow's Lenin Stadium. Ireland were missing Paul McGrath, and Owen Hand chose to adopt a 3-5-2 formation. The Ireland lineup we have Seamus McDonough in goal from Notts County, Chris Hughton of Tottenham, David O'Leary of Arsenal, Mark Lawrenson of Liverpool, Mick McCarthy of Manchester City, Jim Beglin of Liverpool. He'd replaced by Kevin O'Callaghan of Portsmouth in the 79th minute, Gary Waddock of Queen's Park Rangers, Tony Grealish of West Bromwich Albion. He'd replaced by Ronnie Whelan of Liverpool in the 71st minute, Liam Brady of Internazionale Milano in Italy, Frank Stapleton, capping the side from Manchester United, and Tony Cascarino of Gillingham. And let me quickly run through the Soviet Union lineup managed by Eduard Malofiev. You have Rinat Dasayev in goal, captain of the side from Spartak Moscow, Gennady Morozov of Spartak Moscow, Alexander Chivadze of Dynamo Tbilisi, Anatoly Demyanenko of Dynamo Kiev, Alexander Bubnov of Spartak Moscow, Sergei Gotsmanov of Dynamo Minsk, Alexander Zavarov of Dynamo Kiev. He'll be replaced by Vladimir Basonov of Dynamo Kiev in the 84th minute, Fyodor Cherenkov of Spartak Moscow, Sergei Aleinikov of Dynamo Minsk, Oleg Protasov of Dnipropetrovsk, Oleg Blokhin of Dynamo Kiev. He replaced by Georgy Kondratiev of Dynamo Minsk in the 55th minute. As far as the match, Ireland actually performed well for almost an hour of the match, and in fact had a penalty appeal in the 13th minute when Chivadze fouled Beglin in the box. That was waved off. However, Soviets playing at home, pressure eventually paid up, and in the 61st minute, Protasov got past Lawrenson and crossed for the unmarked Cherenkov to open the scoring. And in the last minute, Protasov himself put the match beyond doubt by scoring from a diving header from Basonov's cross. And Ireland's faint hopes were gone after this match. And even though they did perform well for an away side. And it was after this match that Owen Hand announced that he would be leaving his post after the match against Denmark, as there was no more hope.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Shahan, yeah, that's a good synopsis of the game. Fortunately, once again, there are extended highlights of the game available on YouTube, because extended highlights were broadcast in Ireland of the game. Just a couple of pointers about the Irish team that lined out. Kevin O'Callaghan that came on as a substitute for Jim Beglin for 79 minutes. This really heralded the end of, or it heralded in a meaningful way of Kevin's international career, because he was only to play once more for Ireland And that was 2 years later in a friendly against Brazil. And this game against the USSR was also Kevin's 20th cap. So really his international career was coming to an end at this stage. But you went down through the Soviet team, and they were quite a good team, because even when you called out the names there, it has brought back memories of how strong that Soviet team were in the mid to late 80s, because I remember a lot of those players performing at the 86 World Cup and the 88 Euros, and some of them even into the 1990 World Cup. But just to go back to this game once again, to give a bit of background, at this time, in 1985, the USSR were unbeaten in competitive home games in 50 years. And if that wasn't a daunting enough proposition for opposition playing the USSR themselves had not conceded a goal in Moscow in 20 years. So that will just give you an idea of the task facing Ireland in this particular game. On hand, he went for a 3-5-2 formation, which could revert to a 5-3-2 when required. And the three defenders, anyway, David O'Leary and Mick McCarthy were the centre halves, and Mark Lawrenson in this game played as a sweeper. You may recall he played midfield in the previous game. For this game, he was switched back to the role of a sweeper. Ireland's first half display was quite good. Jim Bakelin was playing quite well. And as you mentioned, Shahan, they could have been awarded a penalty early on. Now, whether the improved performance was down to the fact that the Irish players were kind of eating trustworthy food or not is unclear. But at any rate, it was one of their better performances. But unfortunately, in the second half, they were gradually undone when the USSR scored on the hour. And of course, once the USSR scored, Ireland were really on the back foot. So with Ireland then committed to attack for the rest of the game, it was little surprise that coming towards the end of the game, the USSR put the game beyond doubt when, on a counter-attack, Oleg Protasov scored. Now, Paul McGrath, of course, was a loss because he missed this game due to injury, and Kevin Sheedy was excluded from the team. And the reason Kevin was excluded was that Owen Hand felt that Kevin had a lack of pace. And the Soviet winners who were playing in this game were quite fast. So Owen obviously wanted fast winners on the Irish side to counteract the speedy Soviets. So because for this reason, Kevin Sheedy was left off the team. Now, just one final point about Owen Hand and the way he had to bring his wife as cook to prepare the meals. The reason why Owen Hand suggested this in the first place was to try and, I suppose in one way, embarrass the FAI into giving the Irish team the use of a chef. But again, because of costs, the FAI were not for budging. So Owen Hand, in the lead up to the game, he happened to mention it to his wife in passing, and his wife came up with the idea that she would go along and prepare the meals. So that was how that came about. So it was quite a unique setup. In many ways, kind of far removed from the standards of today. But I suppose in one way, this was the mid-1980s, and maybe certainly in Ireland anyway, kind of maybe people accepted their place in the whole scheme of things. So maybe things weren't as questioned as much as they would be today. But yeah, so that was that. So as you mentioned, Shahan, this defeat in Moscow finished Ireland's chances of qualifying, and Owen Hand announced that he would be resigning after the next game against Denmark.
So we come to this match against Denmark, Owen Hand's last match as Ireland manager on November 13th at Dublin's Lansdowne Road. There's also some story before this match. Apparently, John O'Shea of the Evening Press had questioned Owen Hand's faith in McCarthy over the likes of Moran or McGrath. And O'Shea had bet £50 that he could beat McCarthy in a race. Owen Hand took the bet and McCarthy beat him in the race. Afterwards, McCarthy asked him if he would fancy best out of three, and John O'Shea agreed. So he raced and he pulled his hamstring. Legend has it that he was injured in the race, but McCarthy claims that he was actually next morning in training. But nevertheless, he believes that this race should have never happened with John O'Shea. So that's just another story about Ireland ahead of this match that was inconsequential as Denmark had qualified. We have to mention this is the Danish Dynamite side of the 80s, one of the best in Europe at the time.
Of course, if I can just quickly come in there for a moment, Shahan, in relation to the John O'Shea and Mick McCarthy story. John O'Shea, of course, would have been one of a group of journalists that would have been extremely critical of Owen Hand for some time in the lead up to this game, even though a lot of people would take the view that Eamon Dunphy was head and shoulders above the naysayers, shall we say, and ultimately led to Owen Hand resigning as manager. But John O'Shea certainly was quite critical. And then in the aftermath of the race with Mick McCarthy, John O'Shea then proceeded to put his own slant on the episode, in that John O'Shea wrote in the Evening Press newspaper that Owen Hand was naive to allow him, in other words, John O'Shea, to race against Mick McCarthy. So Owen Hand admitted afterwards that he was naive in that respect. But I mean, at this stage, it was Owen Hand's last game, and Owen Hand mentioned in his book that even he was getting tired of the naysaying journalists in Ireland being on his back at this stage. So I suppose out of a sense of being fed up with all the bickering that was going on, he said to John O'Shea that he could come down to the training ground and miss Mick McCarthy if he wanted to. But so that was the legend as to that particular race between John O'Shea and Mick McCarthy.
Paul, let me ask you about this. In the research of this, I learned that Owen Hand had made overtures to Coventry's Brian Kilcline and Steve McMahon to play for the Republic, but both refused, saying they prefer to wait for England. Did you know anything about these? Were there any stories about that?
I don't remember those. Maybe McMahon, I think I'd heard that one. And obviously this is something that becomes more evident in the Jack Charlton era, this kind of search for players that are eligible for the Republic playing in the English League. Tony Cascarino's already in there, and I think we've got a story a little bit later on about his credentials to play for Ireland. Yeah, in this case, yeah. So I think it's first sign that the Republic are obviously going to cast the net a little bit wider and be looking for players that might be eligible for the team that gathers pace in the Jack Charlton era.
Yeah, but then again, Paul, just to quickly reply to that, Brian Kilcline and Steve McMahon, I actually came across that story as well. But both of them said at the time that they would prefer to wait and see would they get a call up from England. So Brian Kilcline never received a call up, and Steve McMahon had a limited enough career with England. So the question was always there if Jack Charlton, because as you know, Jack Charlton was a much bigger personality than Owen Hand. So would these players have refused an approach from Jack Charlton? And then on top of that as well, Paul, and I mean, we even see it today or now in 2021 with the Republic of Ireland national team. We're having even difficulty at the moment getting prospective eligible players to declare for Ireland. So when an international team is not successful, players naturally enough may be slow to declare for that international team. Because, I mean, go back to the late 80s and early 1990s, when Ireland when they were at the peak of their powers, they had little or no difficulty, it seemed, in getting players to declare for Ireland. But it's like everything, I guess, when a team is not successful, players won't be inclined to declare anyway.
This is true. Well, certainly of those two, McMahon, I think, would definitely have improved the team, but Kilcline would have been a strange one because the centre of defence seemed to be one of the stronger areas for the Republic at this time, that they had quite a lot of top quality options there.
Yeah. And then, of course, as well, Paul, now I know at this time as well, but I think it's as well just to quickly mention this year, the criteria for playing in international soccer was much more stringent than it was today, because, as you know, nowadays, or a number of years ago, FIFA changed a rule where a player could, for instance, play underage or maybe non-competitive games for one country and play competitive games for another country. But up to the last decade, and certainly in the 1980s and 90s, even if a player, I believe, played, for instance, an under-21 match for a country, that ruled him out of representing another country at senior level.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and this actually became very evident in the late 80s and early 1990s when actually Steve Bruce, who of course played for Manchester United, he was keen on playing for the Republic of Ireland, but he had played
for a B
a
side,
game.
I'm sure.
Yeah. He had played a B match for England, and that ruled him out, or that ruled him ineligible to play for Ireland. Now, of course, I mean, in today's world, I mean, that would not have been a problem, but back then it was. So there was that problem for smaller countries like Ireland to contend with as well.
Let's come to this match against Denmark. For this last match of the Owen Hand era, you have Seamus McDonough in goal, playing in his 25th and final cap for the Republic. His first cap had been in 1981. And at this time, he was playing for Wichita Wings in USA. Then you have Kevin Moran of Manchester United, Mark Lawrenson of Liverpool, David O'Leary of Arsenal, Jim Beglin of Liverpool, Paul McGrath of Manchester United, Tony Grealish of West Bromwich Albion. He was also playing in his final cap, his 45th and final cap for the Republic. His first cap had been in 1976. He replaced by Patrick Byrne of Shamrock Rovers in the 30th minute. Then you have Liam Brady of Internazionale Milano in Italy, Kevin Sheedy of Everton. He'd be replaced by the late Michael Robinson of Queen's Park Rangers in the 69th minute. Frank Stapleton captaining the side from Manchester United, and Tony Cascarino of Gillingham. Now, for this match, Owen Hand adopted a 4-3-3 formation with Moran and O'Leary in the center and Lawrenson as a sweeper. And Jim Beglin was as left back, and McGrath was on the right side of the midfield, but was essentially playing as a right back. Let's also go through the Denmark lineup. You have Troels Rasmussen of Aarhus, Soren Busk of MVV in Holland, captaining the side Morten Olsen of Anderlecht. He'd be replaced by Frank Arnesen of PSV Eindhoven in the 69th minute. Ivan Nilsson of Feyenoord, John Sivbeck of Vejle, Jesper Olsen of Manchester United, Soren Lerby of Bayern Munich. He'd be replaced by Jens Jorn Bertelsen of Auro of Switzerland in the 59th minute. In fact, he was replaced and he immediately flew back to play in a West German Cup match.
Yeah, that's right.
So you have Jan Molby of Liverpool, Klaus Berggren of Pisa in Italy, Preben Elker of Verona in Italy, and Michael Laudrup of Juventus in Italy, side managed by Sepp Piontek. Well, the match itself, Frank Stapleton would give Ireland the lead in the 6th minute, but almost immediately Preben Elker tied the match. Michael Laudrup would double the lead for Denmark in the 49th minute. Siv Beck would score in the 57th minute, and Elker would round out the scoring in the 76th minute for a 4-1 Denmark win. This was Ireland's worst defeat under Owen Hand and the worst defeat at home since 1971. And it ended the 13-year-old unbeaten home record in competitive competitions. So the Owen Hand era ended in a dismal note. We have to mention Owen Hand had been in charge since 1980. He did adequately enough in the 1982 World Cup qualifiers, but it seemed like he didn't build up on that relative success. And the side stagnated for the 84 Euro qualifiers and, of course, these 1986 World Cup qualifiers. So I don't think it was much of a surprise that he was leaving at this point.
No. And I mean, certainly throughout 1985 and coming to the end of Owen Hand's tenure, I mean, and I will come on to this in a few moments, the abuse that he and his family were getting persuaded him that it was time to go as well. But just to go back to this game, first of all, against Denmark, the attendance at the game was 12,000. So that really speaks for itself. And I believe of that 12,000 attendance, 6,000 came from Denmark. So you could say only 6,000 Irish supporters turned up for this game. So it really was something of the petering out, I suppose, of Owen Hand's managerial career as such, because he was leaving the post after this game. In one way, there was no pressure on him. So he decided to maybe experiment a little bit with the formation. But unfortunately, against a quality side like Denmark, experimenting was a very dangerous thing. And I suppose it was really the final nail in Owen Hand's coffin as Ireland manager, because first of all, just a couple of points about the team that played there. Noticeable as well that for two of the team, Jim McDonagh and Tony Grealish, this was their last appearance for Ireland. Maybe Jack Charlton, maybe when he took over, he did not maybe feel that these players, maybe he felt they were over the hill or that they could no longer make a contribution to the Irish national team. Kevin Sheedy played in this game, but this was his last appearance until the following October against Scotland. So it took a while for him to be selected by Jack Charlton. And indeed, Tony Cascarino, he fell out of favour after this game, and his next cap was not to be for another 2.5 years, May 1988, in a friendly against Poland in the lead up to Euro 88. So it was noticeable as well, this game, in that, the number of players that seemed to, I suppose, depart the international stage or disappear off the international stage for a while. Owen Hand played 5-3-2 formation again with 3 centre-backs, but this time it failed because the Danish movement was too good. Now, the whole of this game, fortunately, is available on YouTube with Danish commentary. Frank Stapleton scored after 7 minutes, but Ireland, for the rest of the game, were basically pulled to pieces. The experiment of playing 3 centre-backs failed quite spectacularly. And you mentioned, Shahan, that Denmark, they were so dominant as the game went on, that they were able to take off Søren Lerbu after 57 minutes so that he could go to Germany to play in a cup game that night. So it was really kind of, I suppose, really a damp squib. And Owen Hand's managerial career suddenly finished on a depressing note. And going forward, it was felt at this stage by the higher echelons in the FAI that the next international manager would be better based in England rather than Ireland. And to add to the gloom in the FAI, later that evening, our neighbours, Northern Ireland, they qualified for their second successive World Cup with a 0-0 draw against England at Wembley. So that too was, as I mentioned in previous podcasts, Northern Ireland's success at this time was adding to the pressure on Owen Hand and on the FAI to have a successful Republic of Ireland international team. So a myriad of factors in that. But this defeat anyway meant that Ireland finished in 4th place in the qualifying group behind Switzerland and just a point ahead of Norway. So really there wasn't much more to be said because it was the end of an era in several ways for Owen Hand and for a number of international players at that time. But I mentioned a few moments ago that kind of by 1985, Owen Hand felt that the personal abuse that he and his family were receiving had become intolerable, because he even says in his book on one instance of his son, actually his son's bicycle, the tyres of it were slashed in school. So that really persuaded Owen Hand that it was time to relinquish the managerial role. And of course, I mentioned the fact that there was a couple of journalists in particular that stood out from the rest of the journalistic pack in persuading people that Owen Hand wasn't up to the job of managing Ireland. Chief among them would have been Eamon Dunphy, of course, the well-known Eamon Dunphy. And a lot of people say actually that Eamon Dunphy played an important role in Owen Hand being left with no alternative but to step down as Ireland manager. But really, it was the end of an era, and it was obvious then that major change was needed because, as you mentioned, Shahan, from going so close to qualifying for the 1982 World Cup, apart from a couple of sporadic good performances since 1982, the Irish team for some reason was really on a downward curve.
We come to the appointment of Jackie Charlton, and that in itself is a story.
Yes.
So now, before we get to that, though, at the behest of Athlone Town's Noel Heavy, it was suggested to set up an investment program, essentially a national lottery with 144 cars as main prizes. This money was to be used to hire a full-time national team manager, to establish a commercial division, and a national coaching training center. The Opel of Ireland were approached to come on board as sponsors. The aforementioned lottery deal was off, but the sponsorship of Opel remained. A new deal was also signed with Adidas for the Ireland kits. The federation appointed Dr. Tony O'Neill as Assistant General Secretary and Donny Butler as the head of the commercial division. Now we come to the candidates for the vacant position. We have, of course, Jackie Charlton, Johnny Giles, Pat Crerand, Noel Cantwell, Theo Foley, Billy McNeil, former Northern Ireland manager Terry Neal. Nottingham Forest blocked any approaches for Brian Clough. Further applications were received by Mark Lawrenson, Liam Toohey, Jimmy Conway, Jim McLaughlin, and Paddy Mulligan. I'm assuming Mark Larson would have been player manager, just like Johnny Giles many years before. That was his idea, I'm assuming. So eventually, a short list was made of Charlton, McNeil, and Toohey. In the following week, McNeil said that Manchester City would not release him from his contract. On February 7th, the first vote was taken for the position. And apparently, at the start of the meeting, Giles phoned to the headquarters to insert himself in the mix. Mm-hmm. And there was a debate, and eventually his name was added to the list.
Yes, Shahan, because just quickly here, Johnny Giles was on the original list of applications, but when Dr. Tony O'Neill and Des Casey spent a weekend in England in December of 1985 interviewing prospective candidates, by the time January came around, Casey and O'Neill were, for some reason, maintaining confidentiality was a big problem. And they felt at this stage that they could not report to the executive committee anymore because their information was, for some reason, it was being leaked to the newspapers in Ireland and being published the following day. And John Giles was unhappy at being a victim of this, I suppose, highly publicised managerial rat race. And because of this, he announced his withdrawal from it. But as you say, later, he was persuaded by a member of the FAI to put himself back into the running for the position. And I believe as well, in addition to the list of candidates that you mentioned, Noel Cantwell was also interviewed in December of 1985 for the role, as indeed was the former Everton manager Gordon Lee. And Gordon Lee's interview apparently took place in a motorway service station.
Also, in addition, the Federation president said that in the last minute, he said that he had spoken to Bob Paisley, the former Liverpool manager, and he also wanted to insert himself in. There was a first ballot of the voting, and Bob Paisley got 9 votes, while Giles, Charlton, and Toohey each received 3 votes. A second ballot was taken, and all the Giles and Toohey votes were transferred to Charlton. And one of the Paisley votes also defected, and Jackie Charlton won the vote 10-8. Would you know what happened in between the first and the second ballot that all those members transferred their votes to Charlton?
Well, Shahan, that is actually one of the great mysteries of Irish soccer, in that it has often been speculated on over the years, and nobody, even, shall we say, even respected journalists here have for some reason been unable to get to the bottom of this. Firstly, as to how, whether by coincidence or otherwise, that those who backed John Giles and Liam Toohey initially en masse switched their support to Jack Charlton. And then, of course, at the decisive moment, when one of Bob Paisley's backers, who to this day remains a mystery, for some reason decided to switch his allegiance to Jack Charlton. So, as I say, it is one of the great mysteries of Irish soccer and has never been solved. So, I think it's safe to say it may never be solved at this stage.
Yes.
But just one other point, I suppose, you see, in many ways, if Bob Paisley had declared his interest earlier and maybe had been available for interview, Bob Paisley may well have got the nod over Jack Charlton. Because if, for instance, that delegate that switched his vote at the last moment, if he had stuck with Bob Paisley, the voting would have been tied 9 votes each. Des Casey, who was president of the AFI, would have had a casting vote, and he was known to favour Bob Paisley. So Bob Paisley would have been appointed on the president's casting vote, but it wasn't to be anyway, and Jack Charlton was appointed by 10 votes to 8. But it goes to show as well, Shahan, that seeing that the voting was so tight, Jack Charlton, even though he had his backers, he wasn't a universal choice for the job, it's safe to say. Because, and we'll discuss this now in more depth shortly, but as we know, he had a stellar career as a player, and he had a kind of, I suppose, a middle-of-the-road managerial career. His managerial career started off quite well at Middlesbrough. They won the second division in 1974, and he also won Manager of the Year in that year. But his two other stints, or succeeding stints in club management, Sheffield Wednesday and Newcastle, he really just kind of seemed to be doing a middling job. It was really kind of steady as she goes. And even though he was doing okay, he wasn't achieving anything spectacular in club management.
Charlton became the first non-Irishman to manage the national team.
Of course, another thing then is that in 1977, when Don Reevy was relieved of his position as England manager, and when the interviews took place to succeed him, Jack Charlton did apply for the job at that stage, but apparently he did not even receive an acknowledgement of his application.
Yeah, I think at that time he wouldn't have been. Firstly, he probably wasn't that experienced as a manager at the time, and obviously with all the problems with Reevy, I think the FA were looking for a safe pair of hands, which they got with Ron Greenwood, and obviously at that time Brian Clough was the other strong candidate. And again, probably his personality counted against him at that time, which might also have been a factor with Jack Charlton as well.
Yes, because I'm even led to believe, Paul, and I'm sure maybe you would agree on this, that even Jack Charlton, even in England, he wasn't everybody's cup of tea there.
No, he was always regarded as a little bit of an abrasive character, I think.
And could be quite blunt and maybe kind of unemotional and unempathetic at times.
Yes.
Yeah, as we'll see now, kind of throughout his time as Ireland manager, we will come across some instances of this.
Yeah, and speaking of his character, even before managing his first match, there were some criticism of Charlton for his treatment of Liam Toohey.
Yes.
Apparently, Charlton installed Maurice Setters as the manager of the under-18 and under-21 squads, while Liam Toohey remained as youth team manager. Now, there's a story that on February 25th, Ireland, the youth team, were playing against England. For his team talk, Liam Toohey apparently invited Charlton to say some inspirational words to the team, but apparently he basically interrupted Tuhi's team talk and just took over and instructed the team and placed Tuhi in a very difficult position, that he was shown that he had no authority in front of his own players. And eventually Tuhi would be forced to resign because of Charlton's abrasive personality.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that was a regrettable episode. But then again, kind of it shows that maybe Liam Tuhi did not have support in the FAI. Because what was significant as well was that nobody from the FAI subsequently took Jack Charlton to task over this particular episode. Now, I mean, Liam Tuhi, we mentioned him in earlier podcasts. He had managed the Irish international team in the early 1970s. He had applied for the position of senior manager again in 1986. But in the years leading up to 1986, he had achieved a lot at youth level. And he was a respected figure in the game in Ireland. And I mean, it was, even looking in at it from the outside, I mean, the ordinary observer, Jack Charlton's conduct on that particular evening was out of order, because I can just imagine what the reaction would be if the boot was on the other foot and Jack Charlton invited Liam Tuhi or anybody else to say a few words to one of Jack Charlton's teams at half time. And if that person was to subsequently take over the team talk, I can just imagine what reaction would be at Jack Charlton's end. But yeah, that was a youth game between Ireland and England. It was played at Elland Road in Leeds. And in actual fact, Jack Charlton originally had not planned to attend this particular game. He was due to attend on the same evening a League Cup tie between Aston Villa and Oxford United. But this game was postponed due to bad weather. So Jack Charlton decided to attend the Youth International instead. Now, I mean, if Jack Charlton maybe had been taken to task by the FAI at this stage, it might have, what happened, shall we say, in subsequent episodes with the treatment of David O'Leary and several other players may not have happened, or may have happened, shall we say, in a more controlled way, or in a less abrupt way. But I guess that was Jack Charlton's way of doing things. And maybe the fact as well that he was a big personality in the game, he was a big personality in the media as well, that maybe, and the fact as well that the Republic of Ireland international senior team were at such a low base that maybe a lot of the top people in the FAI felt that maybe they should just give Jack Charlton a free hand and let him get on with the role unimpeded of turning the fortunes of the senior team around, even if that meant treading on some toes along the way. Just before that, Shahan, and just going quickly again, going back to Jack Charlton's appointment. He was appointed, as you mentioned, on Friday, the 7th of February. Now, it seems as though that he wasn't overly expecting to get the job, because after the meeting, Jack Charlton was not immediately available to be contacted, because Des Casey, the president of the FAI, made an unsuccessful attempt to contact him. But less than 48 hours later, Jack Charlton certainly lost no time in getting down to his job, because 48 hours later, on Sunday, 9th of February, a top-of-the-table English First Division game was taking place between Liverpool and Manchester United at Anfield. Jack Charlton attended that game, and what was a sign of the times at that stage was that in that game, you had 6 Republic of Ireland internationals playing in a top-of-the-table First Division game, 3 on each side. Lawrenson, Beglin and Whelan for Liverpool, and of course for Manchester United you had McGrath, Stapleton and Kevin Moran. So that will give you an idea as to, although the Republic weren't achieving at senior international level, they did have good club players and players that were playing at the top level in England and playing at a consistent level in England. Again, the following Wednesday, then, the 12th of February, Jack Charlton arrived in Dublin to give his first press conference as manager. He gave his first press conference as Ireland manager, and for the most part, anyway, it was a low-key enough affair. Jack Charlton basically outlined his plans for the Irish team. He felt that the players Ireland had over the years that maybe should have qualified for tournaments in the past, and he felt that he would be able to bring some tactical nous and maybe some extra managerial know-how to take the Irish team from being nearly men into international contenders and qualifiers for major tournaments. So reaction anyway to Jack Charlton's appointment at this stage, even among the the Irish journalistic press was mixed. Some were kind of pointing to his lack of experience, and some kind of were pointing to his abrasive personality, but others were prepared to give him a chance, because in many ways the stock of the Republic of Ireland senior team was so low at this stage that in many ways things could only improve. They couldn't really bottom out any more than they had done. But towards the end of this press conference anyway, and actually this sowed the seed for a lot of the enmity between Eamon Dunphy and Jack Charlton, which manifested itself in later years. Peter Byrne, who was the soccer correspondent with the Irish Times newspaper, he posed a question to Des Casey, who was the president of the FAI, about the voting process that resulted in a delegate switching their vote at the last moment to Jack Charlton over Bob Paisley. And that. So Des Casey anyway was about to answer the question. But Jack Charlton shown his another example of his belligerence. Jack Charlton jumped in and ruled the question out of order, that this wasn't time or the place to be putting that question. But Eamon Dunphy anyway spoke up, and he was the soccer correspondent with the Sunday Tribune newspaper at this stage, and he opined that it was in the public interest that this question be answered. So Jack Charlton obviously took exception to that, and the story goes anyway that he invited Dunphy outside the room to sort the matter out. And and after that invitation, then he gave Dunphy an icy glare, stood up and left the press conference. So the press conference did come to quite, shall we say, a sparky conclusion, and it did, as I say, sow the seed for the bickering and the enmity that was evident between Eamon Dunphy and Jack Charlton in the following years.
We come to this new year, 1986, and Jackie Charlton's first match in charge. This was on March 26th, 1986, at Dublin's Lansdowne Road versus Wales. Now, this was the 60th anniversary of Ireland's first ever international. For this match, Jackie Charlton springs a few surprises by giving two new caps to a pair of Oxford United players. You have the first cap for Ray Houghton, who was actually Glasgow born, but his parents were from Donegal, and John Aldridge, who was Liverpool born but had Irish ancestry. For this very first match, this is Jackie Charlton's first lineup. Ger Payton in goal from Fulham, David Langan of Oxford, David O'Leary of Arsenal, John Anderson of Newcastle. He'd be replaced by Mick McCarthy of Manchester City in the 50th minute, Jim Beglin of Liverpool. We mentioned Ray Houghton of Oxford. Captaining the side, Liam Brady of Internazionale Milano in Italy, Paul McGrath of Manchester United, Ronnie Whelan of Liverpool, John Aldridge of Oxford, Mick Robinson of Queen's Park Rangers, and he'd replaced by Patrick Byrne of Shamrock Rovers in the 66th minute. Obviously, the selections of Houghton and Aldridge indicated the path that Jackie Charlton would take in selecting players, the famous grandparent rule. Let me also quickly go through the Welsh lineup. You have Neville Southwell of Everton in goal. He'd replaced by Tony Norman of Hull City in the 66th minute. He was injured after a fall. Robbie James of Queen's Park Rangers, Kenny Jackett of Watford, Peter Nicholas of Luton, Jeremy Charles of Oxford, Joey Jones of Huddersfield Town, Stephen Lowndes of Millwall, David Phillips of Manchester City, Ian Rush of Liverpool, Clayton Blackmore of Manchester United, Gordon Davies of Manchester City, and he replaced by Dean Saunders of Brighton in the 61st minute for a side managed by Michael England. The match itself, the Welsh would win with a goal in the 17th minute. Phillips takes a corner. It was flicked on by James to an unmarked Ian Rush to head home. It was said that Jackie Charlton blamed O'Leary for this goal. And that's why he was initially dropped for the trip to Iceland that we will get to.
Yes.
At the end of the season.
Well, first of all, as I said, opinion was, even at this stage, was still divided on Jack Charlton's appointment because, first of all, the attendance at this game was 16,500 people. And I actually, now, there's little highlights available on YouTube, but there has been a widely circulated photograph of a section of the crowd at that game. And there was a banner saying, "Go home, Union Jack." So it was obvious at this stage that Jack was going to have to win over a lot of the Irish soccer public because, I mean, his treatment, if I can just go back again to the episode with Liam Tuohy and the Youth International, I mean, Charlton's treatment of Liam Tuohy, it did still rankle with a lot of people involved in Irish international soccer, certainly at the grassroots and, shall we say, the local level. And it had been actually the wish of a number of FAI officials that when Jack Charlton was appointed as manager, that Liam Tuohy would have been installed as his assistant. But as you mentioned earlier, Shahan, Jack Charlton went for Maurice Setters. And maybe Jack Charlton saw Liam Tuohy as a threat to him. Because sometime after this, when a vacancy came up for the National Director of Coaching in Ireland, Jack Charlton vetoed Liam Tuohy's application and he gave the position to Maurice Setters. Now, like, you could say in the following years, even though I know now we're jumping slightly ahead, that Jack Charlton did owe a lot to Liam Tuohy because at this time, the Irish youth teams were making a mark at international level and in international tournaments. And there was a good supply of up-and-coming young talent coming through. And a lot of this talent graduated itself onto Jack Charlton's senior international team in the following years. So, in one sense, Jack Charlton should have been grateful to Liam Tuohy for bringing through this crop of talented youngsters. But again, kind of for the reasons that we have already outlined, Jack Charlton saw fit to dispense with Liam Tuohy. But going back to this game then, as I said, David O'Leary, as you mentioned, Jack Charlton blamed him, or apportioned the blame to him, for the winning goal scored by Ian Rush. This was David O'Leary's 40th cap also. And as we'll see, this turned out to be his last appearance for Ireland for over 2.5 years until November 1988 against Spain. Now, one other thing, John Anderson, who played in this game, of course, he would have been known to Jack Charlton, because John Anderson spent time at Newcastle United. And this was John Anderson's first appearance for Ireland in almost 2 years, since June 1984 against China. So Jack obviously was, in some respects, he adopted a kind of maybe a new broom sweeps clean approach in that several of the players that featured prominently under own hand were discarded at this stage. And Jack brought in players, as you mentioned, such as Ray Houghton and John Aldridge. And of course, other players were to come in the succeeding games. So Jack was obviously going to put his own imprint on the team, bring in his own style of play and his own, shall we say, type of players. But the game itself, anyway, there's little highlights available, and the little highlights that are available anyway, apart from the Ian Rush goal, the game seems to have been quite an uneventful affair. So it was, you could say, an inauspicious start. But what was significant was that following this defeat against Wales, this was to be the last occasion for 6 years that Ireland would lose a game in Dublin at senior international level. And coincidentally, the next game they lost 6 years later, in February 1992, was also a friendly against Wales, played at the RDS ground. It was an inauspicious start, but in its own way, it kind of heralded as to what was to come, in the fact that Ireland, even though it wasn't foreseen at the time, were to go on a long unbeaten run at home.
The following month, on April 23rd, another friendly match at Dublin's Lansdowne Road. Again, a meager crowd of 14,000. Ireland hosted Uruguay. Uruguay, they were paired with Scotland at the World Cup. So I'm sure they looked upon Ireland as British opposition to prepare themselves for the match against Scotland. For this match, Jackie Charlton would adopt a 4-3-3 system. O'Leary, Moran, McGrath were unavailable. Charlton proceeded to give new caps to some League of Ireland players. Going through the lineup, you have Paddy Bonner of Celtic Glasgow back in the side. I don't remember when was his last cap. It must have been maybe the year before.
Yes, so, I think actually, off the top of my head, Shahan, it could have been the game against England at Wembley.
Oh, 85. Yeah. 85, yeah.
Yeah, 85, yes.
Then you have David Langan of Oxford, Mick McCarthy of Manchester City, earning his first and only cap in the center of defense, Barry Murphy of Bohemians of Dublin, Chris Hughton of Tottenham. He replaced by another new cap, Peter Eccles of Shamrock Rovers in the 80th minute. Again, this was his one and only cap. Ray Houghton of Oxford, Jerry Daly of Shrewsbury Town, a new cap, Liam O'Brien of Shamrock Rovers. He would join Manchester United in, I guess, the following season or maybe year after. Tony Galvin of Tottenham, captaining the side Frank Stapleton of Manchester United, and he be replaced by John Byrne of Queen's Park Rangers in the 67th minute and John Aldridge of Oxford. And going through the Uruguay side managed by Omar Boras, you have Fernando Alves of Peñarol, Victor Diogo of Palmeiras in Brazil, Cesar Vega of Danubio, Nelson Gutierrez of River Plate of Argentina, Eliseo Rivero of Peñarol, captaining the side Jorge Barrios of Olympiacos of Greece, Venancio Ramos of Racing Lens in France, Mario Saralegui of Elche in Spain, Vilmar Cabrera of Valencia in Spain, Jose Zalazar of Peñarol, and Ruben Paz of Internacional Porto Alegre of Brazil. The match would end up as a 1-1 tie. So Uruguay would take the lead in the 23rd minute after Ruben Paz's free kick was deflected by Mick McCarthy. Ireland would tie the match in the 39th minute after they were awarded a kick when Aldridge was elbowed by Gutierrez in the box. Sign of the things to come at the World Cup. Daly would score from an ensuing penalty kick and tie the match. The interesting thing about this match is the abundance of the League of Ireland players in this lineup. And of course, it will be the last time that so many League of Ireland players will be selected under Charlton, and eventually none at all by the end of the season.
Yes.
Into the 2002, I think that was the next time where League of Ireland player would be in the lineup, and it shows how it was English First Division centric team under Charlton.
Yes. But of course, I suppose to counter that, Shahan, you could say that Charlton would have had virtually no knowledge of the Irish club game at this stage. So he was obviously going to cast the net far and wide. And I'm sure he wouldn't even have been aware as to how strong or how weak the National League was in Ireland. So he would have obviously given an opportunity for the best players in that league to make a mark on the international stage. Now, as it turned out, obviously, it was with little impact, but at least you could say that Jack was casting the net far and wide in search of talent. Now, just a couple of pointers about this game quickly. There was no Liverpool or Everton players as selected for this game. So obviously you could take from that Jack was maybe in experimental mode. And then you see you had Liverpool they were fighting it out for the First Division title, and Everton were in with a shout as well. And of course, Liverpool and Everton had the FA Cup final to come up. So maybe either the players the Liverpool and Everton players weren't released for this game, or with a few of the busy running that these clubs were going to have, maybe Jack Charlton decided not to approach Liverpool and Everton for the release of these players. And maybe he just wanted to look at some fringe players. So this, by the way, was Uruguay's second game in 48 hours, because Uruguay apparently were undertaking a mini European tour at this stage in order to prepare for the World Cup. And on 48 hours earlier, on the Monday, they had played Wales in another friendly in Wales. So, I mean, Uruguay were obviously giving fringe players a run in this mini European tour as well. Ireland finished the game anyway with 3 League of One players on the pitch. One of them, you mentioned Liam O'Brien. He subsequently, or the following autumn, secured a transfer to Manchester United. And in actual fact, he has gone down actually in Irish soccer folklore, because in early 1987, very early 1987, in fact, he was named in the Manchester United team to play Southampton in an English League game. And because of the fact that it was his debut for Manchester United, the game was televised live in Ireland on RTÉ television, because there was great interest in Liam O'Brien and the fact that he had gone from the League of One to Manchester United and was maybe beginning to slowly, or the possibility was there that he was starting to establish himself in the Manchester United first team. So this game against Southampton anyway was his debut. The game was televised live in Ireland, and the viewers anyway only got to see 75 seconds of him, because after 75 seconds, and this must surely be in a record, he received a straight red card. So he had quite a conspicuous debut for Manchester United, as it turned out. Now, this game against Uruguay was his debut, but he wasn't played for Ireland until the following May in friendly against Brazil. So, obviously, Jack Charlton saw him in this game, and maybe, I suppose, for one reason or another, discarded him for the time being. Yeah, so apart from that, again, little or no highlights on YouTube. In actual fact, the highlights are very, very scant indeed. So impossible to definitively analyse this game, except that it was a useful workout, I'm sure, for both teams. Uruguay in their preparation for the World Cup, and from an Irish point of view, it was given some more players a chance to take a claim for inclusion in future Ireland squads.
We come to the famous end of the season tour at Reykjavik in May 1986. Ireland were invited by Iceland in a triangular tournament involving the host Iceland, Republic of Ireland, and Czechoslovakia. This tournament was to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the founding of Reykjavik. You mentioned about the David O'Leary discarding. Why don't you pick up the story?
Well, first of all, as we know, it has been well publicised. It was publicised both then and in intervening years. Basically, to sum up, this was an end-of-season tour, and Jack Charlton named his squad for this tour. The Liverpool contingent, first of all, withdrew because they were undergoing their own end-of-season tour themselves. So that meant that he was without, you could say, 3 first-choice players. David O'Leary had been initially left out of the squad for this tour, but upon the withdrawal of the Liverpool players, Jack Charlton subsequently contacted David O'Leary and asked him to join up with the squad. In the interim, David O'Leary had booked a family holiday. He informed Jack Charlton that he would be unavailable for this tournament because he had booked a family holiday. And to sum up anyway, apparently that was where the conversation ended. And as we all know, David O'Leary was not to be selected again for another 2.5 years. So again, it did show some disparity in that the Liverpool players that pulled out the tour, they were integrated into the squad once again straight away the following September. Whereas David O'Leary, for some reason, was excluded for 2.5 years. So it did show the disparity in maybe Jack Charlton's judgment of players and his logic in applying a bit of sense to certain situations. But apparently it seems that the following August, Liverpool were undertaking a pre-season tour of Ireland. and they played a friendly game in Cork, which is a city in the south of Ireland. Jack Charlton attended this game, and the story goes that he remonstrated after this game with Kenny Dalglish as to why the Liverpool players were not released for the Irish tour of Iceland. And apparently Kenny Dalglish told Jack Charlton that if any of the Liverpool players were to be scapegoated in the way that David O'Leary was to be subsequently scapegoated by Jack Charlton, that Kenny would make all of the Liverpool Irish contingent unavailable for international selection going forward. So you see, this was an instance of where when Jack Charlton was faced with confrontation, sometimes he tended to back down. But on the other hand, David O'Leary had nobody to speak on his behalf. He didn't have, shall we say, his club manager, for instance, was not prepared to speak up for him. And because of that, Jack Charlton basically was given carte blanche to deal with David O'Leary in his own way, which he did by excluding him from the international setup for the next 2.5 years. And of course, this thing contributed as well. I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Shahan, that there was a bit of enmity even already at this stage between Eamon Dunphy and Jack Charlton. And this accentuated the enmity in that Eamon Dunphy rated David O'Leary highly as a player, whereas on the other hand, Eamon Dunphy didn't rate Mick McCarthy. And of course, with Jack Charlton, the boot was on the other foot. Mick McCarthy was rated very highly with him, whereas David O'Leary was not. Mick McCarthy would have been highly rated by Jack because in many ways, Jack, I think it's fair to say, would have seen Mick as his own embodiment as a player. Tough as Teague, maybe awkward, but someone who got the job done, maybe took no prisoners and was a durable centre-half. Whereas David O'Leary was more skillful, he was more ball playing, he was maybe more creative. But for some reason, Jack Charlton felt that maybe this was a risk, having a skillful, creative ball-playing defender. So maybe for that reason, Jack Charlton preferred Mick McCarthy over David O'Leary.
Let's get into this tournament, this Iceland Triangular Tournament. It started on May 25th at Reykjavik with Iceland hosting the Republic of Ireland. For this match, Jackie Charlton selected Paddy Bonner in goal from Celtic Glasgow, John Anderson of Newcastle, Kevin Moran of Manchester United, Mick McCarthy of Manchester City, Chris Hughton of Tottenham. He'd replaced by Patrick Byrne of Shamrock Rovers in the 46th minute, Ray Houghton of Oxford, Paul McGrath of Manchester United. He replaced by Jerry Daly of Shrewsbury Town in the 70th minute. Earning his first cap, Mick Kennedy of Portsmouth. And you have Tony Galvin of Tottenham. Frank Stapleton, captaining the side from Manchester United. John Aldridge of Oxford. And he replaced by another debutant, Niall Quinn of Arsenal in the 84th minute. And quickly going to the Iceland side, you have Bjarni Sigurdsson of Valur, August Mar Johnson of KR Reykjavik. He replaced by Gudni Bergson of Valur in the 79th minute. He would join Tottenham at some point, right? Gudni Bergson. You guys remember?
That's right.
Yes.
Yes, I think he was around when they won the FA Cup in 1991.
Yes. So then you have Gunnar Gislason of KR Reykjavik, Loftur Olafsson of KR Reykjavik, Sigurdur Johnson. At this time, he was playing at Barnsley on loan from Sheffield Wednesday. Of course, in time he joined Arsenal. He was replaced by Olafur Thordarson of IA Akrans, Halldór Askelsson of Tor Akureyri. He replaced by Gudmundur Steinsson of Fram Reykjavik in the 62nd minute, Petur Ormslev of Fram Reykjavik, Arnur Gudjonsson, father of Eidur Gudjonsson. At this time, he was at Anderlecht in Belgium. Vidar Thorkelsson of Fram Reykjavik, Ragnar Margersson of Waterschei in Belgium, and captaining the side, Petur Pettersson of Hercules Alicante in Spain. Side managed by the West German Sigi Held.
Of course, Sigi Held, of course, he played for West Germany. He was prominent. He was particularly prominent in the 1970 World Cup, and he may have featured in 1966 as well.
Yes, that's right. That's correct. Yes.
Mm.
For this match, Jackie Charlton adopted a 4-3-3 system. McCarthy and Moran were a central defensive partnership. So Ireland would take the lead in the 34th minute. Houghton took a free kick from the left. McCarthy headed across, and McGrath volleyed from close range. In the 40th minute, Gudjonsson tried to cross for Pettersson. However, Bonner misjudged the flight of the ball and he handled it, but the ball went in. Houghton was replaced in the second half by Byrne, who went to the right back position, and Anderson went to the left back position. And also McGrath was taken up with an ankle injury and replaced by Daly, who was scored a winning goal in the 84th minute. In the 84th minute, a corner by Kennedy was cleared back to Daly. His first shot was blocked, but then he scored from the rebound to give Jackie Charlton his first win as Ireland manager. What do you remember from this match?
Well, little or nothing, to be honest, Shahan, because, again, highlights on YouTube are very scant. The tournament was not covered in Ireland on TV. And in actual fact, I recall that the only game that was covered in any shape was the next game against Czechoslovakia, which was covered on RT radio. Because of this victory against Iceland, Ireland, by the time they played Czechoslovakia, had put themselves into a position of winning this tournament. So for that reason alone, it was covered live on RT radio. But didn't see any footage of this game against Iceland over the years, maybe apart from the Paul McGrath goal. Actually, just one quick point about Paul McGrath, and this may not be a well-known fact. He was actually Jack Charlton's initial choice for the captaincy, because in the lead-up to Jack Charlton's first game against Wales, Jack Charlton approached Paul McGrath the day before the game, and he said, "Paul, you can bring the ball out because you're captain." But Paul kind of, as you know, he was and still is maybe an introvert and media shy to an extent and so on. So he felt that having the weight of captaincy on him would be an additional burden. So in his own quiet way anyway, he said to Jack that he would prefer if he wasn't captain. So subsequently the armband was awarded to Frank Stapleton. So anyway, going back to this game against Iceland, Mick Kennedy, as you mentioned, he was with Portsmouth. This was his debut. It was noteworthy for three players on the team. Kevin Moran, this was his 20th cap for Ireland. Chris Houghton won his 30th cap. And Frank Stapleton, the captain, this was his 50th cap for the Republic. So it was a noteworthy game for these aforementioned players. It was still taking time for the players to adjust to Jack Charlton's style of play, because Jack Charlton's style of play was alien to a lot of these players. So it did take some time for them to adjust. But this, anyway, was a win, a welcome win at that. And just racking my brains here, I think, this was the first Irish victory, I should say, in any international since the previous June against Switzerland. And it was the first win of the Jack Charlton era. So it did, naturally enough, bring its own bit of confidence, or breed its own bit of confidence among the players. As I say, little or no highlights available, so there isn't really much can be said in this game, except it was a win, and it set Ireland up for a winner-takes-all match in this tournament in the next game, which was 2 days later against Czechoslovakia.
On May 27th at Reykjavik, Ireland took on Czechoslovakia. For this match, you have Ger Payton in goal from Fulham, Patrick Byrne of Shamrock Rovers, Kevin Moran of Manchester United, captaining the side Mick McCarthy of Manchester City, John Anderson of Newcastle. He replaced by Mick Kennedy of Portsmouth in the 46th minute. This was his second and final cap for Mick Kennedy. Mick Robinson of Queen's Park Rangers. This was also his 24th and final cap. His first cap had been in 1980. He'd be replaced by Jerry Daly of Shrewsbury Town in the 67th minute, Ray Houghton of Oxford, Paul McGrath of Manchester United, Tony Galvin of Tottenham, John Aldridge of Oxford, Niall Quinn of Arsenal, and he replaced by Frank Stapleton of Manchester United in the 55th minute. Quickly going through the Czechoslovakia lineup managed by Josef Masopust, you have Ludek Midlosko of Baník Ostrava, Stanislav Levy of Bohemians Prague, František Straka of Sparta Prague, Josef Chovanec of Sparta Prague, Jan Fiala of Dukla Prague, Karel Kula of Baník Ostrava, Jan Berger of Sparta Prague, Ivan Hasek of Sparta Prague, Miroslav Siva of Ruda Cheb. He replaced by Ivo Naflacek of Slavia Prague in the 76th minute, Milan Luhovi of Dukla Prague. He replaced by Lubos Kubik of Slavia Prague in the 56th minute, Ladislav Vizek of Dukla Prague, and he replaced by Josef Novak of Dukla Prague in the 80th minute. We should mention that Patrick Byrne, we already mentioned that Jackie Charlton would no longer select League of Ireland players. So Patrick Byrne of Shamrock Rovers, this was the last time any League of Ireland player will be playing for the national team until 2002. There's an incident in the 60th minute. McGrath's cross was handled in a box by Straka, and Ireland were awarded a penalty kick. John Aldridge missed a penalty kick. In fact, he would not score for Ireland for at least 2 more years. I think it was against Tunisia, right, in 1988.
That's right. Yes, yeah. That's right.
Despite remaining Jackie Charlton's first choice as striker, it would take him 2 years to break his duck internationally, even though he was a prolific goal scorer at club level for Liverpool in 87 and 88. But he missed his chance to open his account for Ireland.
It actually took him 29 games to score for Ireland.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
20, yeah. But I think a lot of that as well, Shahan, was down to the fact that, and even John Aldridge and even Jack Charlton admitted this himself, John Aldridge, he couldn't be sort of a fox in the box when he was playing for Ireland. You know, he had to kind of very often go into the corners and chase down lost causes and all that. So maybe he wasn't in front of goal as often as he should have been, or as often as he would have been at club level. So that could explain his lack of international goals, as certainly in his first 29 games. But once he broke his duck in October of 88, the goals started flowing fairly regularly after that.
Another interesting point about this win is that this was Ireland's first win while wearing a white kit with green shorts and green socks. That's something that stood out. I guess it never happened before.
Probably not.
Yeah. So as far as Ireland's winning goal in the 83rd minute, Lubos Kubik lost possession in the middle of the field from pressure by McGrath and Galvin. Stapleton picked up the ball and just raced away and took a hard shot from the edge of the box to give Ireland the win. By winning this match, Ireland won this triangular tournament. This is their only international tournament win to date, I believe.
That's right, Chess. Yeah. Well, first of all, Shahan, impossible to analyse this game because, as far as I'm aware, there's no footage of it whatsoever on YouTube. So, I remember actually as a 10-year-old listening to the radio commentary of it here in Ireland. But of course, you know, from a radio commentary, it's very, very difficult to kind of analyse the game in any forensic detail, except just to say that, it was another win for the Republic. It was their first international tournament win. And even though many of the players were still adapting to the style of football that Jack Charlton wanted them to play, the fact that they were getting success out of it, I think maybe convinced some of the doubters that maybe this was the way to go forward and this was the style of football to play in order to be successful at international level. Because I recall actually in 1996, there was a documentary made on Jack Charlton's time as Ireland manager after Jack stepped down from the post. Kevin Warren was interviewed for it, and Kevin alluded to the fact that this international tournament really was a game changer, because he said, even though a lot of the players at the time, himself included, were kind of sceptical as to the style of football that Jack wanted them to play, Kevin said, when you start achieving results and having success playing this particular way, you sort of tend to believe that this is the way to go. Yeah, so maybe, as I say, successes like this, Jack Charlton was beginning to slowly win over the doubters. And he was beginning, I suppose, to win over some of the doubting players as well. And of course, the real litmus test was to be the following September with the commencement of the Euro 88 qualifying campaign. But as I say, it was a promising start, and the signs were slowly but surely, they were boding well, and the fruits, or the good days, they were slowly beginning to come to fruition. Of course, we should, just before we wrap up in this game, Shahan, just to quickly mention Czechoslovakia. Of course, their goalkeeper was Ludo Iklasko, who of course later played West Ham United. Yes. And of course, their manager, Josef Masopust, he was a star of the 1962 World Cup.
Yes, Ballon d'Or winner, 1962, in fact.
That's right, yes, that's right. And I think he was one of the leading scorers at that 62 World Cup.
Yeah, he scored the first goal. He scored in the final against Brazil, in fact. Yeah.
Yes.
One of the greatest players of Czechoslovakian history. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So he certainly had a track record at playing level anyway. So that terminated the international season that year for the Republic. Jack Charlton was laying down markers, it's fair to say. And after a somewhat inauspicious start, his way and his methods, they were slowly starting to bear results. But as I said, the litmus test was to come the following season with the commencement of the Euro 88 qualifiers. And of course, we should also bear in mind as well that Liam Brady was the active figure for Jack Charlton at this stage. And as we will see in the future, Liam Brady was another player that suffered because of his different views with Jack Charlton on how the game should be played and how Liam should play his own particular game.
Unfortunately, also age was kind of catching up with him as well.
It was, yes, that's right.
At the kind of the worst possible time with this new era.
Yes, of course. So slowly but surely, Jack Charlton was weeding through the talent as to what was available, giving players the opportunity to state their claim. And as we'll see, some after this season never played again, and others, their contribution in future was limited. So maybe at this stage, he was beginning to form in his own mind what his best 11 was going to be. Of course, David O'Leary was, as we mentioned already, he was to be a conspicuous absentee for the next 2.5 years. But another factor as well that maybe contributed to that was that at this time, Jack Charlton, in many ways, he had an abundance of centre-backs. So much so that Paul McGrath, for instance, was deployed in midfield and deployed on a continuous basis in midfield at this time and for the next couple of years. Paul McGrath was to become a mainstay of the Irish midfield the next couple of years. And again, because of that, there was an abundance of centre-backs there. So it gave Jack Charlton the leeway to take the easy way out and make an example of David O'Leary.
Yeah, and Mark Lawrenson was starting to be sort of phased out a little bit as well, having been a mainstay for many years as well.
Yeah, but Mark Lawrenson, of course, missed a tour of Iceland because this Liverpool end of season tour. He was to come back into the team the following autumn for the qualifiers. But as you say, Paul, he was slowly beginning to be phased out as well. And of course, in 1988, as we know, he had a career-ending injury, which finished his international career. So it was the beginning of the end for some players, and it was the beginning for other players, namely the new recruits like Ray Houghton and John Aldridge, and as we'll see in the following seasons, other new recruits were to join the Irish ranks as well.
Yeah, Jerry Daly as well. I think he would maybe play one more match, I think, after this in the fall.
Yeah. I think he actually, off the top of my head, was the game the following October against Scotland in the Euro qualifiers in Dublin. But interestingly enough, Shahan, John Barnes was interviewed in 1990 in the run-up to the England-Ireland game, one of the England-Ireland games that year. And what John Barnes said was that Charlton style, it wasn't very pretty to watch, but with the right ingredients, it could be quite successful. Because John Barnes made the point that at Watford under Graham Taylor, they played a very similar type of game as well. And I think this game was, or this style of play was instigated, was it in the 1970s or thereabouts, by a guy called Charles Hughes, and it was called POMO, P-O-M-O, Position of Maximum Opportunity.
Paul, what was the takeaway in England? I'm sure there would have been some more interest given that Jackie Charlton was the manager now.
Yeah, definitely. And, to echo what John was saying, he was known for producing tough teams, playing a bit longer, quite a physical, competitive game. And as you say, sort of building the side around that. And it's unfortunate, certainly for Liam Brady at this stage of his career, that he's kind of not really fitting into that style of play. And the players he's bringing in are obviously, I think the next season, both Houghton and Aldridge go to Liverpool and become part of that very successful team. And really, it's a squad, as we've touched on, sort of built around the top teams of the first divisions. There's definitely got the players at his disposal, and it's just a matter of finding that system. A lot of these players were available to Owen Hand as well, so it's obviously testament to Jack Charlton that he found that system that brought the best out of them and the best of the players that he had available.
Yeah, and then, of course, we should bear in mind as well, Paul, of course, that the 85-86 season, this was the first season that English clubs were banned from European competition. So for players based in England, their only way of participating outside of England domestically was through international soccer games.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
so that could have been a factor as well as to why more players declared for the Republic of Ireland and indeed other international teams as well for the next number of years.
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant point to that. Yeah.
We touched on there, and no doubt we will touch on again in future podcasts about Jack Charlton. On occasions, he could be quite abrasive, and he could be, shall we say, undiplomatic and unsympathetic. But an interesting point as well is now whether this was purely coincidental or if it was part of an overall plan was unclear. But the disagreements that Jack Charlton had with players and personnel up to this stage and in the intervening years, people such as Liam Toohey, and then players such as Liam Brady, David O'Leary, Frank Stapleton in later years, Ronnie Whelan, of course, in later years. These were all native-born Irish players. So it seemed to be that Jack Charlton, kind of the people that he had disagreements with, all tended to be Irish natives. And in each case, the beneficiary of, shall we say, Irish-born players being excluded from his teams were English-born players. So whether this was just purely coincidental or whether it was part of a grand plan that Jack Charlton had is unclear, and it's a question that has been, remained unanswered. But I suppose ultimately at the end of the day, it's very much like today, soccer is a results-driven business, and when Jack Charlton started getting results, players and the public bought into the system that he was implementing on the Irish team, because it was, as I say, a system designed to disrupt the opposition. In actual fact, for home games in Lansdowne Road at this time and for a number of years afterwards, Jack Charlton actually often requested that the grass be left lawn, so that would stifle opposing international teams, who were skillful and who could play the ball on the ground a little bit, having maybe a bumpy pitch, which we have to bear in mind was predominantly and still is a rugby stadium and a rugby venue. But having the pitch or having the grass lawn on a bumpy surface. This was stifling, shall we say, superior international teams as well when they came to Dublin to play Ireland. Teams that would have been superior in skill and in ball playing ability on the ground.
For our next podcast, we'll discuss the first full season of Jackie Charlton in charge, the 1986-87 season and the 1980 Euro qualifiers.
Because, of course, Ireland were at a low standing in international soccer at this stage. They were handed an extremely tough qualifying group for Euro 88 in that they were in with Belgium, Bulgaria, Scotland and Luxembourg. And, of course, we had only one team to qualify. Qualification was naturally going to be difficult. And, I mean, Belgium, Bulgaria and Scotland had all qualified for the 86 World Cup in Mexico. So that was kind of an indicator of the size of the task that was awaiting Jack Charlton and the Irish team when the Euro qualifiers got underway the following September.
And we will discuss that season in detail. Once again, we would like to thank Mr. O'Carroll for his participation in this series. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. For any questions and comments, you may contact me on my blog or Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on his blog, The 1888 Letter, and on Twitter, he's at 1888 Letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Mr. O'Carroll can be contacted via email, johnocarroll0@gmail.com, or on Facebook under John O'Carroll. Again, all this information is on the blog and the Spotify uploads. So, John, thank you once again, and looking forward to the next time.
Yeah, likewise, Shahan, and always a pleasure and a privilege to be involved with these podcasts and to speak with you and Paul, and looking forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, no problem.